The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Morrison adjusted his red tunic and checked his rifle for the 100th time. 20 years of service had taught him that every detail mattered when protecting the royal family. The tourists were already gathering behind the iron gates, cameras ready to capture the famous changing of the guard ceremony. James had seen it all during his career. Protesters trying to scale the fence, tourists fainting in the summer heat, and countless attempts by visitors to get the guards to break their stoic composure. He had learned to see everything while appearing to see nothing, to remain perfectly still while staying completely alert. The palace grounds buzzed with the usual morning activity. Staff members hurried across the courtyard carrying fresh flowers for the staterooms. Security personnel in plain clothes mingled with the early tourists, their trained eyes scanning for anything unusual. James noticed Detective Inspector Sarah Collins near the main entrance, her auburn hair catching the morning light as she spoke quietly into her radio. "Another busy day ahead," muttered Corporal Davies, the young guard standing beside James. "School group scheduled for this afternoon. Plus the German ambassador's visit?" James nodded slightly, never breaking his forward gaze. Davies was new to the palace detail, still learning the subtle art of royal protection. The boy had excellent military training, but palace duty required something more. It demanded an almost supernatural awareness of human behavior. The ability to spot danger in a crowd of innocent faces. A tour bus pulled up outside the gates, and James watched as 30 schoolchildren poured out, their excited chatter filling the morning air. Their teacher, a woman in her 50s with graying hair, struggled to organize them into a proper line. The children pressed against the fence, pointing at the guards and whispering among themselves. Among the group, James spotted a little girl who seemed different from the others. While her classmates laughed and pointed, she stood quietly at the back, her dark eyes fixed on him with unusual intensity. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with tangled brown hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in days. Something about her stillness caught his attention. The girl's teacher was counting heads, trying to keep track of the energetic group. "Stay together, children," she called out. "We'll be starting our tour in just a few minutes." James noticed the girl wasn't wearing the same school uniform as the others. Her jacket was too big, her shoes were scuffed, and there was something in her eyes that looked far older than her years. She kept glancing around nervously, as if searching for someone or something. Detective Inspector Collins had noticed the girl too. James saw her moving closer to the fence, her hand resting casually near her radio. Years of training had taught both of them to trust their instincts, and something about this situation felt wrong. The tour guide arrived, a cheerful woman in a blue blazer who began explaining the history of the palace to the children. Most of them listened eagerly, but the little girl remained focused on James. She took a small step forward, then another, slowly separating herself from the group. "The guards you see here," the tour guide was saying, "are highly trained soldiers who have sworn to protect the royal family with their lives. They undergo months of special training and must remain perfectly still during their duties." One of the boys in the group raised his hand. "What happens if they need to use the bathroom?" The other children giggled, and the tour guide smiled. "They have very strict schedules and take turns throughout the day." While everyone's attention was on the guide, the little girl moved even closer to the fence. James could see her more clearly now. There was dirt under her fingernails, and what looked like bruises on her arms, barely visible beneath her oversized jacket. His training kicked in, cataloging every detail that might be important. The girl looked around carefully, making sure no one was watching her. Then she did something that made James's blood run cold. She raised her hand to her face and made a series of quick, deliberate gestures. It wasn't random child behavior or an attempt to get his attention. It was a signal. The hand signs were from a safety program taught in schools across the country. James recognized them immediately from the briefings all palace security had received. The girl was spelling out HELP in the silent alphabet used by children who couldn't speak their distress aloud. James felt his pulse quicken, but years of training kept his expression neutral. The girl repeated the signal, her small hands shaking slightly as she formed each letter. She glanced nervously over her shoulder, then back at James. her eyes pleading for him to understand. Behind her, the tour guide was still talking about palace history. Completely unaware of the drama unfolding just meters away, the other children were listening, asking questions, and taking photos. But this little girl was trapped in her own nightmare. Using the only method she knew to call for help, James's mind raced through the protocols. He wasn't supposed to move, speak, or acknowledge anything happening around him. Breaking protocol could result in disciplinary action, or worse, dismissal from the elite palace guard. But those rules seemed meaningless now, as he watched a terrified child, desperately trying to communicate her danger. The girl's teacher called out, "Emma, stay with the group, please." The little girl's head snapped around, and James saw pure terror flash across her face. She quickly dropped her hands and stepped back toward the other children. But her eyes remained locked on his. James noticed a man standing at the edge of the tourist crowd, partially hidden behind a pillar. The man was watching Emma intently, his jaw clenched with barely controlled anger. He was tall and thin, with greasy hair and clothes that had seen better days. When Emma looked in his direction, gave her a look that made her shrink back against the fence. Detective Inspector Collins had moved closer. Pretending to check her phone while keeping one eye on the situation, James knew she had seen the signal too. The question now was what they could do about it.
Ow.
Without alerting the man who was clearly Emma's captor, the tour guide announced that it was time to move to the next stop on their visit. The children began walking away from the fence, chattering excitedly about what they had learned. Emma hesitated, looking back at James one more time. She raised her hand slightly as if to repeat her signal, but the man stepped forward and grabbed her shoulder roughly. "Come along, Emma," he said loudly enough for others to hear. "We don't want to keep the group waiting." Emma's face went white, but she nodded obediently and allowed herself to be guided away from the fence. James watched them go, every instinct screaming at him to act. In just a few seconds, he would have to make a choice that could change everything. James Morrison had less than 30 seconds to make the most important decision of his military career. Emma and her captor were walking away with the tour group, and soon they would disappear into the crowd of London tourists. Every fiber of his being told him that if he let this moment pass, he might never see the little girl again. Protocol demanded that he remain motionless at his post. Royal guards were famous worldwide for their unwavering discipline. Their ability to stand like statues, regardless of what happened around them. James had maintained this composure through thunderstorms, protests, and even when a tourist had collapsed right at his feet. But this was different. Through his peripheral vision, he could see Detective Inspector Collins moving carefully through the crowd, trying to get closer to Emma without alerting the man. But there were too many people, and the tour group was already heading toward the palace gates where they would enter the building and be beyond. Immediate help. The man's grip on Emma's shoulder tightened as they walked. James could see the little girl wincing in pain, but she didn't dare cry out. Whatever hold this man had over her, it was powerful enough to keep her silent, even when surrounded by potential rescuers. "Emma seems like such a quiet child," the teacher commented to the man. "Is she your daughter?" "Niece," the man replied quickly. "She's been through a difficult time lately. Lost her parents in an accident. Still very traumatized." The teacher's expression softened with sympathy. "Oh, the poor dear. Well, perhaps this outing will help cheer her up a bit." James watched this exchange with growing urgency. The man's story was probably convincing enough to fool well-meaning adults. Who would suspect that a child abductor would boldly join a school tour group? It was actually brilliant in its audacity. Emma glanced back one more time, her eyes finding James across the courtyard. In that brief moment, their gazes locked, and he could see her desperation. She mouthed a single word that made his decision for him: "Please." James Morrison broke protocol. He stepped forward from his position, his sudden movement causing gasps from the remaining tourists near the fence. In 20 years of service, he had never abandoned his post during duty hours. But as he strode across the courtyard, his mind was crystal clear about what he had to do. Sir," he called out in his strongest military voice. "Sir, please stop where you are." The tour group halted, confused by the interruption. The man holding Emma went rigid, his hand instinctively tightening on her shoulder. Emma's eyes widened with a mixture of hope and terror. "Is there a problem, guard?" the tour guide asked. Clearly flustered by this break in routine, James approached with measured steps, his hand resting on his radio. He had called for backup the moment he left his post, and he knew Collins was positioning herself to block any escape routes. "I need to speak with this gentleman," James said, pointing directly at Emma's captor. "There's been a security concern raised about someone matching his description." It was a lie, but it was the only way he could think of to separate the man from Emma without causing immediate panic among the children. The teacher looked alarmed, and several of the other children pressed closer to her. The man's eyes darted around the courtyard, calculating his options. He was trapped between James approaching from one side and Detective Inspector Collins, who was now openly displaying her badge from the other. But his grip on Emma never loosened. "I don't know what you're talking about," the man said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're just here for the tour. Emma is my niece, and we have every right to be here." James stopped about 10 feet away, close enough to act quickly if needed, but far enough to avoid spooking the man into doing something desperate. He had dealt with dangerous situations before, but never with a child's life hanging in the balance. "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding," James said calmly, "but I'm going to need to see some identification, and I'll need to speak with the young lady privately to verify your relationship." "You have no authority to demand anything from me," the man snapped, his composure beginning to crack. "I'm a British citizen, and this is harassment." Detective Inspector Collins had reached the group and was now speaking quietly with the teacher, explaining the situation. James could see the woman's face go pale as she realized what might be happening. Emma looked up at the man holding her. James saw a flicker of defiance cross her features. The little girl who had been too terrified to speak was finding courage in the presence of help. "He's not my uncle," Emma said in a voice barely above a whisper. But in the sudden silence that fell over the group, everyone heard her clearly. The man's grip shifted to her wrist, and James saw him squeeze hard enough to make her gasp. "Don't be silly, Emma. You're just confused because you're tired." "No," Emma said louder this time. "He's not my family. He took me from the park yesterday. My real name isn't Emma, it's Sophie." The revelation hit the group like a physical blow. The teacher stepped back, pulling the other children with her. Parents who had been watching from nearby moved protectively in front of their own kids. The tour guide fumbled for her radio to call for additional security. James saw the exact moment when the man realized his deception was over. The friendly mask slipped away, replaced by something cold and dangerous. His free hand moved inside his jacket, and James knew they were out of time for careful negotiations. "Everyone back away. Now," James ordered, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades of military service. The civilians scattered, pulling children to safety behind the palace barriers. Collins drew her weapon, but couldn't get a clear shot with. Sophie still in the man's grip. James was closer, but any wrong move could put the girl in greater danger. "Let her go," James said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "You're surrounded, and there's no way out of here. But if you release her now, we can work something out." The man laughed, a bitter sound that made Sophie flinch. "Work something out? Do you have any idea how long I've been planning this? How long I've been watching her?" James felt sick at the implications, but he kept his expression neutral. "What do you want? There has to be something you want." "I want what was promised to me," the man said, his eyes wild now. "I was supposed to have time with her. Uninterrupted time, but now." He didn't finish the sentence, but James understood. This wasn't a random kidnapping. This was something far more sinister, something that had been planned and organized. Sophie wasn't this man's first victim. She wouldn't be his last if they didn't stop him here. Sophie looked up at James. Her small face streaked with tears, but her eyes determined. She had been brave enough to signal for help, and now she was being brave enough to speak the truth, despite her terror. "He has pictures," Sophie whispered. "Pictures of other kids." In his car, James felt his jaw clench. This was exactly what every law enforcement officer dreaded most. But it also meant they couldn't let this man leave under any circumstances. "Sir," James said, stepping slightly closer, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. There are armed officers surrounding this area right now. There are security cameras recording everything. And there are about 50 witnesses who have heard this little girl identify you as her kidnapper. Your only chance of getting out of this without someone getting hurt is to let her go right now." The man's hand tightened on Sophie's wrist, making her cry out in pain. It was the sound James had been dreading, but it also told him everything he needed to know about what kind of person they were dealing with. "Step back, guard," the man warned. "Step back, or I'll hurt her worse than this." James raised his hand slightly, appearing to comply. But his years of military training had taught him to recognize when negotiation was over and action became necessary. The man was escalating, becoming more dangerous by the second. Soon, Sophie wouldn't just be a hostage. She would become a victim of his rage and desperation. The moment for careful protocol and patient negotiation had passed. James Morrison was about to do something that would either save a little girl's life or destroy his own career forever. Time seemed to slow down as James Morrison assessed every detail of the dangerous standoff. Sophie's captor was approximately 6 feet tall, lanky build, with his right hand gripping the child's wrist and his left hand inside his jacket. James could see the outline of something bulky against the fabric. Whether it was a weapon or not, he couldn't take any chances. Detective Inspector Collins had positioned herself behind one of the palace's ornamental pillars, her firearm drawn but lowered. She was speaking rapidly into her radio, coordinating with the armed response teams that were undoubtedly racing toward their location. But James knew that backup would take precious minutes to arrive, and they didn't have that kind of time. Sophie's eyes were locked on his face, and James could see her trying to communicate something to him. She kept glancing down at the man's feet, then back up at James. It took him a moment to understand what she was telling him. The man was wearing cheap sneakers with worn-out soles. His stance was unsteady, favoring his left leg slightly, as if he had an old injury. James filed away this information while continuing to speak in calm, measured tones. "You don't want to hurt her," he said to the man. "I can see that you're not a violent person. This whole situation has just gotten out of hand." "You don't know anything about me," the man snarled back. "You don't know what I've been through, what I deserve." James noticed the way he said deserve, and it confirmed his worst fears about the man's intentions. This wasn't someone who could be reasoned with using logic or appeals to his better nature. This was someone who felt entitled to harm innocent children. The palace courtyard had been completely cleared of tourists and staff members, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the distant sound of approaching sirens. James knew that once the full tactical team arrived, the situation would change dramatically. The man would realize he had no escape route, and that's when hostage situations often turn deadly. "Let me tell you what I think is going to happen," James said, taking another small step closer. "I think you're going to realize that you can't win this. There's nowhere to run, and more police are arriving every second. Your best option is to let Sophie go and surrender peacefully." "My name is Sophie," the little girl said suddenly, finding her voice again. "Sophie Chen, my mummy and daddy are probably looking for me right now." James saw tears forming in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. She was being incredibly brave for someone so young, and her words seemed to have an effect on her captor. For just a moment, his grip loosened slightly. "My daddy teaches karate," Sophie continued, looking directly at James as she spoke. "He taught me that when someone grabs you, you're supposed to stomp on their foot really hard and then run." The man looked down at her with annoyance. "Be quiet, or you'll make things worse for yourself." But James understood exactly what Sophie was doing. She was giving him information about her father and simultaneously letting him know that she understood how to break free if the opportunity arose. This 8-year-old child was showing more tactical awareness than some trained soldiers he had known. Collins had moved to a better position and was now within about 20 feet of the man's left side. James could see her waiting for a clear shot, but Sophie was still too close to her captor for any kind of gunfire to be safe. "Sophie," James said carefully, "your parents are definitely looking for you. In fact, I bet they've called the police, and everyone in London is trying to find you right now." This was likely true. Missing children cases received immediate priority, and if Sophie had been taken from a public park, there would already be search teams mobilized across the city. The man's agitation was increasing by the moment. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air, and James could see his hands trembling slightly. These were signs that the situation was approaching a breaking point. "I need you to think about what you really want here," James continued, his voice remaining calm even as his muscles tensed for action. "Do you want to spend the rest of your life in prison for harming a child? Or do you want to let her go and maybe have a chance at working things out?" "It's too late for that," the man said bitterly. As soon as she opened her mouth, it was too late for working anything out. James felt his heart sink. This wasn't someone who was planning to surrender. This was someone who had decided that if he couldn't have what he wanted, he was going to make sure everyone else paid the price. Sophie seemed to sense the change in the man's demeanor, too. She looked up at James and gave him the slightest nod, as if she was ready for whatever needed to happen next. Her small hand slowly moved toward her captor's foot, positioning herself for the move her father had taught her. The sound of vehicle doors slamming echoed from the street outside the palace gates. The tactical response team had arrived, and they would be taking positions around the perimeter within moments. James knew this was probably their last chance to resolve the situation before it escalated to a level that could result in tragedy. "Listen to me very carefully," James said to the man, his voice taking on a harder edge. "In about 30 seconds, this courtyard is going to be surrounded by armed police officers with sniper rifles. They're not going to negotiate with you the way I am. They're going to see a man threatening a child, and they're going to take whatever action they think is necessary to protect her." The man's eyes darted around the courtyard, and James could see him beginning to panic as the reality of his situation fully sank in. Panic made people unpredictable, and unpredictability was dangerous when a child's life was at stake. "But right now," James continued, "it's still just you, me, and Detective Collins. We can still handle this quietly, without anyone getting hurt. All you have to do is let go of Sophie's hand." Sophie was positioned perfectly now, her foot directly above her captor's worn sneaker. James could see her muscles tensing as she prepared to execute the escape move her father had taught her. But the timing would have to be perfect. If she moved too early or too late, it could make the situation much worse. Collins caught James's eye and gave him the slightest nod. She was ready to move as soon as Sophie broke free from the man's grip. Everything now depended on a few seconds of perfect coordination between a royal guard, a police detective, and an 8-year-old girl who had already shown more courage than most adults would in the same situation. James took one more step closer, drawing the man's full attention to himself. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly. The unexpected question seemed to catch the man off guard. "What? Your name? What do people call you?" "That doesn't matter now," the man said, but James could see confusion in his eyes. "It matters to me," James replied, "because I want to know who I'm talking to. I want to know who has the chance to do the right thing here." The man hesitated, and James saw Sophie's muscles coil like a spring. She was waiting for the perfect moment when her captor's attention was fully focused on something else. "Marcus," the man said finally. "My name is Marcus." "Okay, Marcus," James said. "Here's what I need you to understand. Whatever happened to you in your life, whatever made you think this was okay, it doesn't have to end this way. You can still choose to be someone different than the person who hurts children." Marcus looked down at Sophie, and for just a moment, James thought he might actually listen to reason. But then the man's expression hardened again, and James knew they were out of time for words. "It's too late," Marcus said. "It's too late for everything." That was the signal Sophie had been waiting for. She stomped down on Marcus's foot with all the force her small body could generate, and the man yelped in surprise and pain, his grip instinctively loosening. The moment Sophie's foot connected with Marcus's worn sneaker, several things happened at once. Marcus howled in pain and surprise, his grip loosening just enough for Sophie to twist free. James Morrison launched himself forward, covering the distance between them in 3 quick strides. Detective Inspector Collins emerged from behind the pillar, her weapon trained on Marcus but held high to avoid any risk to the child. Sophie scrambled away from Marcus, running directly toward James as she had been trained to do. James caught her in one arm while using his other hand to grab Marcus's wrist, preventing him from reaching whatever was hidden inside his jacket. "Stay down," Collins shouted, moving in quickly to assist with the arrest. "Hands where I can see them." Marcus struggled against James's grip, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "You don't understand," he gasped. "She was supposed to be mine. They promised me she would be mine." The words sent a chill through James as he realized this was part of something much larger than a simple kidnapping. Marcus wasn't working alone. Someone had promised him access to Sophie, which meant there was an organized network involved in child trafficking. Sophie clung to James's arm, her small body shaking with adrenaline and relief. "Thank you," she whispered over and over. "Thank you for helping me." James felt a fierce protective instinct surge through him. This little girl had shown incredible bravery, but she was still just a child who had been through a traumatic experience. "You're safe now," he told her gently. "You're safe, and we're going to make sure you get back to your parents." Collins had secured Marcus in handcuffs and was reading him his rights while backup officers flooded into the courtyard. The tactical response team that had been positioned around the palace perimeter began standing down, their crisis averted. Sophie Chen, age 8. Reported missing from Regent's Park yesterday evening, one of the arriving officers reported after checking his radio. "Parents have been notified that she's been found safe." James felt a wave of relief wash over him. Sophie would be reunited with her family, and Marcus would face justice for his crimes. But as he looked around the now crowded courtyard, he realized that his own situation was far from resolved. Colonel Harrison, the commanding officer of the palace guard, strode across the courtyard with a thunderous expression on his face. James had never seen the colonel look so angry, and he knew that breaking protocol in such a dramatic fashion would have serious consequences. "Sergeant Morrison," Colonel Harrison barked, "step away from the child and report to my office immediately." James reluctantly released Sophie, who was quickly taken into the care of a female police officer specially trained in child welfare cases. As she was led away, Sophie looked back at James one more time. "Will I see you again?" she asked. James managed to smile, despite his growing concern about his own future. "I hope so, Sophie. I hope so." The next hour passed in a blur of debriefings, incident reports, and increasingly stern conversations with superior officers. James found himself sitting across from Colonel Harrison's desk, feeling like a soldier facing a court-martial. 20 years of exemplary service, Colonel Harrison said, reviewing James's file. "Commendations for bravery, leadership awards, perfect attendance record. And then you throw it all away by abandoning your post during a public ceremony." James kept his eyes forward, maintaining military bearing despite the circumstances. "Sir, I observed a child in immediate danger and made a tactical decision to intervene. Made an unauthorized decision that violated direct orders and broke centuries of royal guard protocol," the colonel corrected sharply. "Do you have any idea how many people witnessed your actions? How many cameras recorded you leaving your post?" James did know. The incident would be all over social media within hours, if it wasn't already. Videos of a Buckingham Palace guard breaking ranks to rescue a kidnapped child would spread around the world, creating both positive and negative attention for the palace security apparatus. "I understand the gravity of my actions," James replied, "but I would make the same choice again if faced with similar circumstances." Otto Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying James with a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. "The thing is, Morrison, your actions may have been unauthorized, but they were also completely successful. The child is safe, the kidnapper is in custody, and according to Detective Inspector Collins, your quick thinking prevented what could have been a much worse situation." James remained silent, unsure where this conversation was heading. However, the colonel continued, "The Royal Guard cannot have soldiers who pick and choose when to follow orders, regardless of their good intentions. The integrity of our entire security system depends on absolute discipline and adherence to protocol." A knock on the office door interrupted the conversation. Colonel Harrison's aide entered and whispered something in his ear. The colonel's eyebrows raised in surprise. "Send them in," he instructed. James turned to see who was entering the office and was shocked to recognize Sophie Chen, now cleaned up and wearing fresh clothes, walking hand in hand with a man and woman who were obviously her parents. Behind them came Detective Inspector Collins and a man in an expensive suit who James didn't recognize. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen wanted to thank Sergeant Morrison personally," Collins explained. "And this is David Whitmore from the Home Office." Sophie broke free from her parents and ran directly to James. throwing her arms around his waist in a fierce hug. "You saved me," she said simply. James knelt down to her level, overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment. "You saved yourself, Sophie. You were the bravest person in that courtyard today." Mr. Chen stepped forward, his eyes bright with tears. "Sergeant Morrison, my wife and I can never adequately express our gratitude for what you did today. Our daughter is alive because you chose to act when others might have hesitated." "Well, Sophie told us how you noticed her signal," Mrs. Chen added. "She said you were the only one who understood what she was trying to say." David Whitmore cleared his throat. "Sergeant Morrison, I'm here representing the Home Secretary's office. The arrest of Marcus Webb has led to the discovery of a significant child trafficking network operating in London. Your actions today not only saved Sophie, but potentially prevented harm to dozens of other children." James felt stunned by this revelation. What had started as one man threatening one child had turned out to be connected to something much larger and more sinister. "The investigation is ongoing," Whitmore continued, "but we've already identified at least 15 other potential victims and several suspects in custody. Mr. Webb is cooperating with authorities. In exchange for a reduced sentence, Colonel Harrison looked troubled by these developments. The idea that such a network had been operating so close to the palace raised serious security concerns. "There's something else," Detective Inspector Collins added. "Sophie, can you tell the Colonel what you told me about how you learned the hand signals?" Sophie looked up at James, then turned to Colonel Harrison. "My teacher taught us about them at school. She said if we were ever in trouble and couldn't talk, we should use the signs to ask for help from police officers or soldiers. The program was instituted last year," Collins explained. "We've been training children across London to recognize and use basic distress signals. Sophie is the first child we know of who successfully used them to alert authorities to danger." James felt a surge of pride in both the program and in Sophie's quick thinking. The system had worked exactly as designed, but only because someone had been trained to recognize the signals and willing to act on them. Sergeant Morrison, Whitmore said, "I've been authorized to offer you a commendation from the Home Secretary for your actions today. Additionally, we'd like you to consider working with us to expand the Child Safety Signal Program to security forces across the United Kingdom." Colonel Harrison looked surprised by this turn of events. A commendation from the Home Secretary would make it very difficult to discipline James for his actions. Regardless of the protocol violations involved, Sophie tugged on James's sleeve to get his attention. "Will you teach other soldiers about the signals?" she asked. "So they can help kids like me?" James looked around the room at all the expectant faces, then back down at Sophie. The little girl who had shown such courage in the face of danger was now asking him to help protect other children. How could he possibly say no to that request? 3 weeks after the incident at Buckingham Palace, James Morrison found himself in a very different kind of meeting room. Instead of facing disciplinary action, he was sitting at a conference table with representatives from Scotland Yard, the Home Office, and Child Protection Services from across the United Kingdom. The commendation from the Home Secretary had arrived with great fanfare, complete with a ceremony attended by Sophie and her parents. The media had picked up the story of the Royal Guard who broke protocol to save a kidnapped child, and public opinion had been overwhelmingly positive. Colonel Harrison had quietly decided that James's actions, while unauthorized, had brought such positive attention. To the Palace Guard, that formal discipline would be counterproductive. Sophie Chen incident has highlighted a critical gap in our security. "Training," said Commander Patricia Walsh from Scotland Yard. "We have thousands of police officers, security guards, and military personnel who interact with the public daily, but very few of them have been trained to recognize distress signals from children." James nodded, still adjusting to his new role as an expert consultant on child safety protocols. "The signal program exists, but it only works if adults know what to look for. Sophie was lucky that I happened to have been briefed on the hand signals just a month before the incident. Which brings us to why you're here," said Miranda Stevens from the Home Office. "We want to create a comprehensive training program that ensures every security professional in the country knows these signals. We're calling it the Sophie Protocol. James felt a mixture of pride and responsibility at hearing the name. Sophie had become something of a celebrity since the incident, appearing on television programs to teach other children about safety signals and speaking at schools about the importance of asking for help. She had handled the attention with remarkable grace for someone so young. The program would have 3 main components, Stevens continued, pulling up a presentation on her laptop. First, mandatory training for all law enforcement and security personnel on recognizing child distress signals. Second, expanded education for children about when and how to use these signals. And third, public awareness campaigns to ensure parents and teachers understand the system. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins, who had been promoted following her role in the Sophie Chen case, added her perspective. The trafficking network we uncovered through Marcus's Webb's arrest has been completely dismantled. We rescued 23 children and arrested 15 adults involved in the operation. But the investigation revealed that some of these children had tried to signal for help before, and their attempts weren't recognized by the adults around them. James felt sick thinking about all the children who might have been saved if more people had known what Sophie knew. How long would it take to implement the training program? He asked. That depends on how quickly we can develop the materials and identify trainers, Stevens replied. We'd like you to lead the development team, working with child psychologists and security experts to create the most effective training possible. But he also felt the weight of responsibility that came with it. I'm a soldier, not an educator. Are you sure I'm the right person for this job? Commander Walsh leaned forward. Sergeant Morrison, you've become the public face of this issue. Children across the country know your name and your story. Parents trust you because you proved that you'll put their children's safety above your own career. That kind of credibility can't be manufactured. James thought about Sophie, who had visited him at the palace twice since the incident. She had told him about the letters she was receiving from other children, some of whom had shared their own scary experiences and thanked her for being brave enough to speak up. There's another consideration, Collins added. The publicity around this case has had an unexpected side effect. We've received over 200 reports from children who say they've been in dangerous situations, but were too scared to tell anyone before now. Sophie's story has given them permission to speak up. This revelation hit James hard. Sophie's courage had created a ripple effect that was encouraging other victims to come forward. If a comprehensive training program could help more adults recognize and respond to these signals, the impact could be enormous. I'll do it, James said. But I want Sophie involved in developing the program. She understands the child's perspective better than any of us. Stevens smiled. We were hoping you'd say that. Sophie and her parents have already agreed to participate. In fact, she has some very specific ideas about how the training should work. Over the following months, James found himself immersed in a world he had never imagined. He worked with child psychologists to understand trauma responses, collaborated with educators to develop age-appropriate training materials, and traveled across the country to pilot training programs with different security organizations. Sophie proved to be an invaluable partner in the project. Her insights into how children think and communicate helped shape training materials that were both practical and effective. She insisted that the signals be simple enough for very young children to remember, but sophisticated enough to convey specific types of danger. The pilot programs were remarkably successful. Security guards at shopping centers reported identifying 3 children in distress situations within the first month of training. Airport security personnel helped reunite a lost child with her family after recognizing her attempts to signal for help. Even school crossing guards were proving effective at spotting children who were being bullied or abused. James's role had evolved from Royal Guard to National Advocate for Child Safety. He still maintained his position at Buckingham Palace, but much of his time was now spent developing and delivering training programs. The irony wasn't lost on him that breaking protocol had led to the most meaningful work of his career. 6 months after the incident, James received a phone call that changed everything once again. Commander Walsh's voice was urgent when she reached him at his office. James, we need you in Manchester immediately, she said. There's been another situation involving the signal protocol, but this one is different. A child used the signals to alert authorities about a terrorist plot. James felt his blood run cold. What kind of plot? We're still gathering details, but it appears a 12-year-old boy overheard adults planning an attack on a school. He tried to tell teachers, but they didn't believe him. So he used the distress signals during a field trip to a museum. The security guard had been through our training program and recognized what the boy was trying to communicate. James was already reaching for his jacket. Have they arrested the suspects? Counter-terrorism units are moving now. But James, there's something else. The boy specifically asked for you. He said he saw you on television and knew you would understand what he was trying to say. As James hurried to catch the next train to Manchester, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that morning in the palace courtyard. What had started as one act of defiance against protocol had become a movement that was saving lives. Across the country, Sophie had taught him that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is break the rules when someone needs help. Now it seemed other children were learning that lesson too. The Sophie protocol wasn't just about hand signals or training programs. It was about creating a world where children knew that someone would always be watching out for them. Ready to act when they needed help most, the train pulled away from London. Carrying James toward another child who had found the courage to signal for help. As the countryside flashed past his window, James Morrison smiled, knowing that his decision to step away from his post that day had been the right one, regardless of the consequences. Some things were more important than protocol, and protecting children was definitely one of them. 1 year after Sophie Chen had changed his life forever, James Morrison stood once again in the courtyard of Buckingham Palace. But this time, he wasn't alone. Beside him stood 50 children from schools across London, all of them graduates of the Sophie Protocol training program. They were here for a special ceremony that would officially recognize the program's success and announce its expansion to schools throughout Europe. Sophie, now 9 years old and taller than when James had first met her, stood at the front of the group wearing a bright blue dress and a confident smile. She had become the unofficial ambassador for child safety, speaking at conferences and helping to train other children in recognition signals. Her parents had established a foundation in her name that provided safety education to schools and underserved communities. "I'm nervous," whispered Tommy, the 12-year-old boy from Manchester who had helped prevent the terrorist attack. He was standing next to Sophie, fidgeting with the medal he would receive for his bravery. "Wait, don't be," Sophie assured him. "Just remember, we're here because we were brave when it mattered. And now other kids will be safer because of what we did." James felt a surge of pride as he watched these children support each other. The terrorist plot Tommy had helped uncover had been far more serious than initially reported. The boy's quick thinking and the guard's proper response had prevented an attack that could have killed hundreds of people. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins, now Commander Collins, thanks to her work on the Child Safety Initiative, approached James with a folder full of statistics. "The latest numbers," she said, handing him the report. "In the past year, the Sophie Protocol has led to the identification and rescue of over 400 children from dangerous situations. We've had successful interventions in cases ranging from kidnapping to domestic abuse to human trafficking." James scanned the numbers, amazed by the program's impact. "And the false positive rate? Less than 2%, Collins replied. "The training has been remarkably effective at helping adults distinguish between genuine distress signals and normal childhood behavior." The ceremony was set to begin in an hour, and James could see palace staff making final preparations. Queen Elizabeth herself would be presenting awards to Sophie, Tommy, and several other children who had used the safety signals to protect themselves or others. It was an unprecedented recognition of the program's importance. Colonel Harrison approached, looking far more relaxed than he had during that tense meeting a year ago. "Morrison, I have to admit, I was certain your career was over when you broke ranks that day." "I never imagined it would lead to all this," James laughed. "Neither did I, sir. I was just trying to help one little girl. Well, that one little girl has managed to change how we approach child safety across 3 continents, the colonel noted. The training program has been adopted by security forces in 12 countries now. Not bad for a day's work." Media crews were setting up their equipment around the courtyard, preparing to broadcast the ceremony live around the world. The story of the royal guard who broke protocol to save a kidnapped child had captured international attention. Leading to similar programs being developed in other countries, Mrs. Chen approached James with a warm smile. "James, I wanted you to see this. Before the ceremony begins," she handed him a thick scrapbook filled with letters and drawings from children around the world. James opened it carefully and was immediately overwhelmed by what he saw. Page after page contained messages from children thanking him and Sophie for teaching them about safety signals. Many included stories of how the training had helped them in their own dangerous situations. One letter from a 10-year-old girl in Scotland read, "Dear Mr. James and Sophie, I used the hand signals when a stranger tried to get me to go with him at the park. A police lady saw me and helped me. Thank you for teaching me how to ask for help without talking." Another from a boy in Wales. "My dad hurts my mum sometimes. I learned the signals at school and used them when we went to the grocery store. Now my mom and I live somewhere safe. Thank you for saving us." James felt tears forming in his eyes as he read message after message from children who had found safety because of the program. Each letter represented a life changed, a family protected, a tragedy prevented. There are over 3,000 letters, Mrs. Chen explained. Sophie reads every one of them. She says it helps her remember why this work is so important. Sophie appeared at James's elbow, having noticed the scrapbook. "My favorite one is from a girl in Germany," she said, flipping to a specific page. She said she was scared of a teacher who made her stay after class and touched her inappropriately. She used our signals during a field trip, and now the teacher's in jail and can't hurt other kids. James marveled at Sophie's maturity in discussing such serious topics. The experience had changed her, giving her a sense of purpose and responsibility that seemed far beyond her years. But she was still a child, still playful and curious about the world around her. "Are you excited about meeting the Queen?" James asked her. Sophie nodded enthusiastically. "My mom said she's very nice and really cares about keeping children safe. I want to ask her if we can teach the signals to kids in other countries too." James smiled, knowing that Sophie would probably get her wish. The Queen had taken a personal interest in the program and had been instrumental in securing funding for its expansion. Commander Collins joined them, checking her watch. "It's almost time to begin. Sophie, Tommy, are you ready?" The children nodded, and James watched as they lined up with the other young heroes who would be recognized today. Each of them had a story of courage, of using the tools they had been given to protect themselves or others. As the ceremony began, James reflected on the chain of events that had led to this moment. It had all started with one little girl who had the courage to signal for help, and one soldier who decided that some rules were worth breaking. Now, children around the world were safer because of that single moment of decision. The Queen arrived precisely on schedule, her presence lending gravity and importance to the proceedings. As she began speaking about the importance of protecting children and the courage shown by all the young people present, James felt a deep sense of satisfaction. When Sophie stepped forward to receive her medal, she looked back at James and gave him a thumbs up. It was the same gesture she had made the first time they met after the incident, when he had visited her in the hospital for a follow-up interview. This program exists because one little girl was brave enough to ask for help. And because one guard was brave enough to give it, the Queen said, looking directly at Sophie and James. Their example reminds us all that protecting our children is everyone's responsibility. After the ceremony, as photographers captured final images and reporters conducted interviews, Sophie found James standing quietly near the same spot where they had first encountered each other. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't seen my signals that day?" she asked him. James considered the question carefully. "I try not to think about that," he admitted. "But I'm grateful every day that I was in the right place at the right time, that I had been trained to recognize what you were telling me." "I'm glad too," Sophie said. "But you know what? I think even if you hadn't been there, someone else would have helped eventually. There are more good people in the world than bad people. We just have to make sure the good people know how to recognize when kids need help." James smiled at her wisdom. In just 1 year, Sophie had gone from victim to advocate to philosopher, helping to create a safer world for children everywhere. Her signal for help that day had become a beacon of hope for thousands of other children as the sun set over Buckingham Palace. James Morrison looked around at the children, parents, officials, and journalists who had gathered to celebrate the Sophie Protocol. What had started as a moment of crisis had become a movement of hope, and at the center of it all was a remarkable little girl who had taught the world that asking for help isn't a sign of weakness. It's an act of courage that can change everything.